The advantage of first doing it in the lab is it gives you a very clear result, because there's now all these other interactions that you see in the field. So it's a much neater experiment. The other advantage, like I explained earlier, it's confined. So it means you can do the experiments without having to worry about the environment because you're not in there. Just quickly taking up what Mafi said about contained. In South Africa, this is also the wording that we use in the regulations and the permits that you get. So the difference between contained and confined is obviously the level of exposure to the environment. So contained means in the lab, there's absolutely no, the chances of having exposure to the environment is, negligible. The same in greenhouses, and this is why when you have a greenhouse registered with the regulators, they will go and have a look at it. Is there a chance that pollen will come out of there? If your water runs down, if you work with microorganisms, where is that water going to? So they will check the containment conditions. This is what you do with the risk management issues. When you go to confined field trials, obviously this is now a controlled environmental release. So confined means it's in the environment. It's not contained within glass or physical barrier. But still, depending on the trade, the regulators then can expect certain levels of confinement conditions. So in the field trials, you will typically have things like guardrails or what do you call empty spaces of land, and it must be a certain distance from commercial production plots, for example, if the things with flower and so forth. So it depends on the risk and the crop again. I remember when I was a little bit involved in the grapevine field trial application that Stellenbosch University had a long time ago. One of the things that they right at the beginning said is they will put bags around the flowers. So that's the way they're in the field. In the first place, this field was separated, the vineyard was separated from all commercial production. And I must also emphasize, while I'm talking about these things, you must remember, when you confine things, this is not about real risk. You just want to bring down any potential risk as low as possible. So the regulators would look at managing it at the best possible way. Does not really, interact or what do you call it, relate to specific risk. And the reason why I think of this is if I do, for example, people are slowly starting in South Africa to talk about GM trees as well. There you want this thing in the field for a long time. This is a good opportunity now to talk about evolution as well of regulators' decision making. In South Africa, you get a field trial permit for a single year. We also had this funny rule of, sorry, you're not allowed to plant the same line, in other words, the same trial on the same piece of land 2 seasons in succession. In my mind, that doesn't make sense, because if you plant it for a second season, it's the same plants that you have there, you're just repeating your field trial. If you have anything like volunteers, you will in any case manage it because you must get good data from them. It's the same plant, so in any case, if there's one volunteer that's between all the other plants, it's the same plant. You won't even be able to distinguish it. So in my mind, it actually limits your exposure to the environment. But they changed that, but it was for a single year. Now you come with trees. So the regulators will have to rethink it. At the moment, the rule is you only get it for 1 year, but it doesn't make sense. And I know we already had examples like sugarcane, where they gave permits, that, I don't know exactly how they worded it, but they still didn't give it to you for 3 years, but they at least said, it's renewable over 2 or 3 seasons or whatever. But when we come to trees, now obviously you would actually want to have a field trial that's going to run at least for 8, 10 years. And you also, in that 8 or 10 years, a tree is going to flower. So there will be pollen produced. So we have to think about these things. So we also have to adapt our thinking from working with maize, which eventually, you remember I told you how your thinking evolves? People got used to maize, and now they think maize is easy. And now suddenly we jump to something. And unfortunately, South Africa has a bad track record of where if things change, the wheels come off a little bit. It takes long, so it will be challenging. So it's, in my mind, one of the responsibilities of, or aspects of risk communication, where you start talking to all the stakeholders way beforehand and say, this is coming. This is how, these are the challenges compared to the old things that we're used to. This is how we suggest it should be treated. So, long way. I must still move quicker. Joel also wants to say something. So, after all of that, that was the principles about risk assessment, and now just in one single slide I summarized the elements of food safety assessment. And I mean, there's tons of literature. This is, like I said, just to summarize you, the principle of food safety assessment is you look at the host plant. If it's safe, we already discussed this, so I don't want to repeat myself, but I mean, if you now take maize and evaluate it, it's got a long history of safe use. If you come with something completely new that the regulators don't understand if it has, you know, allergenicity or toxicity issues, it will be much more difficult. So you described, and for this reason, if you also, what I can say is, you know, like what would we say, call them, the basis of most food safety regulation things in the world, or in any case in our perspective, is the OECD. So this is based on their kind of guidelines as well. And they developed what they call biology documents. So the biology document is there as almost like your context for that GMO event when you do a food safety assessment. So they will tell you what are the nutritional values, typically, the variation. That if you do an analysis on your GM plant, in the end of the day, you know exactly if it falls within those limits or not. So there's a huge amount of information already available on which you can base your analysis. Then on the other side, you look at your donor organism, and then in particular, obviously, the traits or the piece of DNA that you transfer. And these can be the gene or the promoters, all those kind of things you'll have to look at, and from each source. Again, I think the simple example would be, like I told you, the BT maize paper that I showed you earlier that we wrote, where we came to the conclusion in the end of the day when people said, oh, the BT maize in South Africa gives them more allergies. When you look through the donor organism, BT, and especially then the only thing, even in the whole organism, there are no allergens ever being characterized. The BT gene itself, the protein itself, all the different proteins have undergone, you know, extensive evaluations over many years, and none of them, because it's a very, what's the opposite of stable, labile protein, and that's one of the characteristics of an allergen, unstable. So, long story to say, you can only look at the host plant and this plant, and then you will realize maize has a lot of well-defined allergen. So in the end of the day, remember this is a new trait like we explained right in the first day, it's a cross. So in that crossing, other genes are also impacted in their expression, and this is what happened in that case, that one of the endogenous allergens of maize was upregulated. Okay, then if you transform the plant, like I said earlier, the molecular characterization, people, I think in the next slide I will show you quickly, people want to know it's a single insert at this stage, all those kind of things. It's stable, obviously you have to show, this is why you do field trials over some generations as well. It's not just going to disappear. And then you do the actual food safety assessment. So you look at the substances that are expressed, both your new one, but also the endogenous ones. Like I said earlier, the regulators will always look at your new introduced proteins in terms of toxicity and allergenicity, but they will also look at the known ones. So if you work with cotton, for example, they will look at gossypol and those things that we know are bad chemicals, anti-metabolites, whatever you call them. Compositional analysis, so this is nutritional value, all those kind of things. Food processing characteristics, if it's relevant, and nutritional modification. So in the end of the day, you must obviously show that you don't have an inferior product in terms of these other generic characterizations. So that's food safety assessment. I don't know if somebody would quickly want to ask something about food safety assessment specifically. But it's really, you remember I said in the beginning, in principle it's actually very simple. People can come to you and show you two-dimensional gel electrophoresis results and metabolomics, the omics are so in these days, they can show you 5 million slides of data for food safety, and you will think it's the most complex thing that it is, but in principle it's not. So finding, you know, the real valuable data, I think, is often the topic of debate. And so just quickly, this, Sandy Snyman from SASWI gave me this. So typically they will look at things like a single copy, I already said stable integration. Obviously, part of just the molecular characterization, you need an identifier that all regulators want that in the world, just to be able, in other words, to detect the GM, and then expression analysis. This is again the example of sugarcane. This is an OECD, or part of an OECD document that was developed for sugarcane. So they just look in, because one of the very early discussions in sugarcane was, if you buy a packet of sucrose, sugar, from the shelf of the shop, this is actually one of the purest chemicals that you can buy off an ordinary shop's thing, because it's 99.99% sucrose. So why should we look at all these other things? But then, you know, people started to realize, obviously, there are many other parts of the crop that are used, and people actually, in KZN, just walk next to the road and eat it, or you will see it at these markets, that they just cut off sugarcane and they put it through mills, so you drink the whole juice, those kind of things. So the bottom line is, for the food safety assessment, you look at the whole plant, and all they did was then to break it up into these different components and say what are the things that you will compare in the end of the day. So you see, for sugarcane, if this was what you had to assess as a risk assessor, the framework is already there to say, look at these different components. So both the regulators and the developers are on the same page to say, this is what is expected of me, at the same time say, this is what I should evaluate. And then environmental risk assessment, I've spoken about this a lot, so again, this is just a summary that I showed you, all those words that I had previously said. Within your context of that environment, you have your risk hypothesis issue. This is the problem formulation part, where you say your potential hazard now is this new protein that I'm expressing. How would it be, you know, lead to some form of harm? So this is your pathway, your exposure component, and then you estimate from those. You estimate your likelihood, your consequence, and you make your decision in the end of the day. So Jill is now just quickly going to do the socioeconomic part.
Okay, so Henny has mentioned that the food safety assessment is fairly straightforward, and that there's lots of information on environmental risk assessment. So what is socioeconomics? Well, socioeconomics is everything else for which there's no actually agreed upon definition. The Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, Article 26, makes provision for countries to take into consideration socioeconomic impacts. The Article 26 states that you may take into account, consistent with its international obligations, socioeconomic considerations arising from the impact of living modified organisms on the sustainable use of biological diversity. So the protocol is a very narrow interpretation. It focuses on only the impacts on biological diversity. And the protocol also states that countries should ensure that when they do take into consideration socioeconomics, that it must be in line, or it mustn't compromise the other international obligations. For example, WTO, SPS agreements. So the idea behind this is to ensure that there's no unnecessary or trade disputes. So the Cartagena Protocol doesn't provide any guidance on how to actually conduct socioeconomics. It leaves it up to countries to decide how they are going to include that. So many countries have taken a broader view of socioeconomics. They not only do some countries include the impacts on biological diversity, but they look at socioeconomic considerations, which include markets, consumer choice, food security, culture, indigenous populations. And examples of this is, if you think of countries, Argentina, for example, takes into consideration socioeconomics on export markets. The Philippines looks at smallholder farmers, they look at gender. You also have countries in Africa. Kenya takes into consideration socioeconomics. Uganda takes into consideration socioeconomics. And Nigeria, I think, goes beyond just saying that they will consider socioeconomics, but they even look at other aspects like culture and I don't know, I'm not too sure, but I don't know if it's ethics or religion. Then we also have South Africa. Now South Africa, socioeconomic legislation has evolved. Initially, the focus is on community. So let me just read this. The council may, in performing its function in terms of the regulation, consider socioeconomic impacts that the introduction of genetically modified organisms may have on a community living in the vicinity of such an introduction. And initially, I think the evolution has occurred because initially the focus was more on environmental impacts and food safety. But this legislation has evolved to now actually it's expanded, the scope of it is expanded. And the regulation now states that, I'm just going to read the red. So it is expanded to include the continued existence and range of diversity of biological resources in the areas inhabited or used by indigenous or local populations. It includes the loss of access to genetic and other natural resources previously available to indigenous or local communities, the loss of cultural traditions, knowledge and practices in particular indigenous or local community as a result of the loss of biological diversity. And then it's further expanded to actually include the loss of income, competitiveness, or economic markets, and also the loss of food security. Now, this legislation has evolved, but it's non-committal and it's rather vague, even though it requires GM developers or may require GM developers to submit a socioeconomic impact assessment. So, Biosafety, South Africa's vision in terms of socioeconomic impact assessment is really to ensure that, within the biosafety regulations, that we can address socioeconomic impacts without hindering actually the process of this decision making. So we'd still like the biosafety or the decision making process to be efficient and effective, even though socioeconomic considerations is considered. So you can see it's a seven-step process. First, you will do scoping. So if you're conducting a socioeconomic impact assessment, you will scope the stakeholders, you will scope the impacts, you will then decide or establish your terms of reference for the socioeconomic impact assessment. You will then compare your initially identified impacts to the baseline profile for that particular GM product. And then on the third step, you will determine the significance of those impacts. Now, if you're looking at this steps 1, 2, and 3, it's a fairly basic kind of socioeconomic assessment, and it's really dependent on the data availability. So if you are a GM developer and you have the necessary data to complete those 3 steps and actually come to a conclusion, you know, that you have a certain level of certainty of whether socioeconomic impacts is acceptable or not acceptable, then you can continue and you can recommend, so if it's acceptable, you can motivate your acceptability and then conclude your socioeconomic impact assessment. It's not, if you have data and it's not acceptable, then you can conclude your socioeconomic impact assessment. However, there's often problems with data, and because there's so little experience or in doing socioeconomics, you know, just to get to that conclusion or to go through the process, it can be tedious and there's often a high level of uncertainty. And if there is that uncertainty, that you, so if there's gaps in data, you'd have to go through the process of actually generating new data. And that would require you, as a GM developer, to either get the appropriate expertise so that you can then generate that data. So in this instance, the GM assessor that is responsible would need to select the appropriate impact analysis in the research methodologies, and then from that, again, you know, determine the impact and the significance of the impacts that the assessors identify. Now, this process is really iterative. It's linear here, but there's so much overlap, and obviously, depending on what it is you find as you go along in the process, you might have to move back, you know, to previous steps. What is maybe not very is not indicated on this framework is that, you know, when conducting a socioeconomic impact assessment, there needs to be some level of engagement, I believe, so that, you know, you can actually make a more, you can make a more accurate kind of assessment, even though it's, if you conduct socioeconomic impact assessment beforehand and there's a lot of unknowns, I think that with the level of engagement with the various stakeholders, that you know, you can represent also their views in your assessment. Okay, so here we have an example of, let me just say that, just coming back to the slide, that when, in terms of this framework, you know, the context, and you spoke about it earlier when you spoke about a risk assessment and setting the context and scope. This is obviously within the South African legislative framework, so all the regulations and that I've mentioned before, that needs to be considered. So here's an example of a socioeconomic impact assessment. We must know that socioeconomic, you have this process, which I described earlier, that 7-step process. And here it's just a mechanism. So for BT Maize, we identified like the value chain, which comprises your input sector, your primary consumers, your output sector, your secondary consumers, and we had definitions for that. So you can see your input sectors, maybe your technology developers here, you have your secondary consumers, primary consumers as purchasers of your raw product. And when you're conducting the socioeconomic assessment, I think this is a good, looking at the value chain is a good way of actually identifying what issues are at stake and who is being impacted, how they're being impacted. And so if we take the value chain, so if you're conducting the socioeconomic impact assessment, you will identify, you know, your key impacts or your key when you're conducting you will identify your keys, when you scope and you identify your key stakeholder groups and your key impacts. And so, yeah, I just want to show that even within the stakeholder groups, the separate stakeholder groups, that within that stakeholder group, you have this variation. So in primary consumers, you maybe have different stakeholders, and obviously any product will impact a particular product impacts different stakeholders differently. So you can see for commercial farmers, small, here we just group them, commercial farmers, smallholder farmers, you know, factors that might be of importance to those farmers is your infestation level, seed prices, adoption, and so these this is only a very limited list of possible factors that can be considered when you're looking at your primary consumers for BT maize. Furthermore, when you have identified particular impacts, you know, there's also a variety of methodologies that you need to use. You just need to make sure that obviously the methodology that you're using is answering the specific question that you have identified, or the specific issue that you have identified up front. So quickly, just the challenges for socioeconomics. Socioeconomic issue, because there's not, you know, we don't have a history of doing socioeconomics on GM crops, and there's often studies done, but it's very, you know, it's fragmented. It's focused on just certain small aspects. Also, we need to identify measurable criteria and what this is and the thresholds. And while I'm saying all this is obviously within the context of the particular product in that particular environment. And then a big challenge is also that there's a lack of appropriate experience in conducting socioeconomic impact assessments. Having said all this, the challenges, I believe that yesterday we had a good presentation in terms of sustainability assessment and how socioeconomic impacts, or the socio-political and the environment and the economic impacts, has a role to play in sustainability, because it will aid decision making and it can assist developers in identifying upfront, you know, if this product is a socially acceptable or economically viable product. Socioeconomics is impact assessments is highly complex. It's context dependent, and for this reason, obviously, depending on what it is, what the GM product is. So if it is BT maize, if it is herbicide tolerance, if it has a herbicide tolerance trait, that these individual products need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. And lastly, for the South African regulations, a socioeconomic impact assessment is required for the for commercial release. But it's important that GM developers actually consider socioeconomic impacts upfront, and that they take the necessary measures to actually, you know, to actually facilitate that kind of assessment while the product is being developed, and that that this requires GM developers to look further than just the actual technology, but that they need to engage with other stakeholders, because socioeconomics is a multidisciplinary. It's a multidisciplinary activity. Thank you.
I think there's two things that I just quickly want to follow up. The first one is the reference to Cartagena Protocol. One of the controversial things on the socioeconomic discussion we had on the last one, South Africa, I think, it's always difficult to say the rest of the African group, because the African group sometimes, everyone goes in his own direction in the end of the day. But we feel strongly that the Cartagena protocol's limited to impacts on biodiversity. So the South African government will always, I think, or I shouldn't say always, I'm not the government, this is what their stance is at the moment, but at the moment they will definitely not like to see the scope broadened there. But immediately you can just see through what Jill discussed here, is that this is not the South African government's perception of socioeconomic impacts of GMOs, because in the legislation it's there. So it's very important to clarify, to say, we don't want it to be fixed in the Cartagena protocol, because that's in a particular context, and obviously that starts up from the environmental perspective. But within our own national legislation, we incorporate this, and this is the kind of thing that the South African government also likes to promote in other areas. And then the second thing I want to emphasize here is that framework that Joel started with is our intent is to have something which is good enough, but does not include a huge amount of new research data. So what's available, what we know, just to put it into context of the new product and see what's happening there. And only if you then can't come with a clear indication on the specific issues that you do, you go into further analysis and see the detail. We should not end up in another huge barrier where you need a data-intensive kind of exercise to try and convince people of things that it's maybe will not change their mind based on data in any case. So quickly then the fourth part of risk analysis.
I have a question. Perhaps I missed something, but if it is concluded on such a basic, on the basis of such a socio-economic impact assessment, that there are very negative issues